So this is going to be a series I call Black Stereotypes and What They're Grounded In. And essentially it's just going to be me telling you what the stereotype is and why people believe this and what kind of social impact this has and mental impact it has on Black people. Number one, Black people can't swim. And this comes from as early as slave trade, when people who would go grab the slaves from Africa or wherever, and they would punish them by throwing them off the boats. And it became such a prevalent thing that sharks would actually follow behind slave trade ships for those bodies. This was further cemented into public knowledge from segregation and civil rights movement. Angry white mobs would come and pour acid and very harmful chemicals into Black swimming pools, so people just didn't go swimming any longer. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 2. Black people love watermelon. This is a really well-known stereotype, and it has been kind of perpetuated and retold for decades. So it started in Jim Crow era, right after emancipation. And the former slaves that are now freed started buying up land and kind of creating their own lives. A lot of former slaves started growing watermelon, and it quickly became a symbol of freedom for them and kind of showed their thriving over everything else. White advertisers and businessmen started seeing the growing market in this and hated it. Therefore, they started advertising that watermelon was unclean and dirty and a lazy fruit. And that's the only thing that Black people could grow. So they started kind of ruining that for them and undermining that. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 3. Black people love fried chicken. Similar to the watermelon stereotype, Black people loving fried chicken has been very pervasive throughout history, especially during slavery and afterward. Therefore, it was very easy for the enslaved to have access to chickens, and jerky and everything started becoming more popular. And fried chicken, if you fry it, it masks the smell of cooking food a lot easier than actually like cooking and sauteing food. However, it wasn't until 1915 when Birth of a Nation, a racist silent film, was released where that stereotype of fried chicken became negative. In that, it shows a group of Black elected officials kicking their feet up, drinking at their desk, and eating fried chicken and just being messy to kind of show what it would be like if Black people were allowed to elect the leaders. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 4. The Jezebel caricature. This is extremely rough, so I'm going to put a content warning. So if you don't want to be triggered, please don't watch this. So like many others, the Jezebel caricature goes back to slavery, and it would portray Black women as very sexually ravenous, and that they were always wanting to have sex, and that you couldn't rape them because they always wanted it. Characters like this would often be used to degrade Black women and promote the assault and objectification of Black women. The rape and assault of Black women would happen so frequently that it was actually a legal defense by white men who would rape those women. This stereotype is still seen today because Black women are often seen as more sexually active. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 5. Black women only wear wigs. This is a stereotype that is grounded after post-emancipation. So after the former enslaved would be freed, they would try to integrate into normal society. In that society, as well as this society we still live in, had beauty ideals, and those beauty ideals were white. Black women's hair was seen as dirty or unkept, so therefore they couldn't get jobs like anyone else. So they would either straighten their hair or wear wigs to look more white. And this kind of social mimicry is still seen today when if you see a Black woman with long hair, people automatically assume she has a wig. And that's not true. That's not fair at all to assume that someone is wearing a wig just because they have long hair. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 6. Black men are sexually violent, or the Mandingo caricature. Now, like the Jezebel video, there's going to be a content warning, so if you get triggered, please don't watch this. The Mandingo caricature and the hypersexualization of Black men originated with slavery. However, it gained more traction post-emancipation. You had propaganda like this being spread about black men would come and rape your innocent white women and ruin them and defile them. You also had books and movies like The Mandingo that perpetrated that black men were extremely sexually violent and that they would come and steal your white women away from you, which didn't happen. Black people in general were very terrified of interacting with any white people because they would be lynched for it. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 7. Angry black women, or the Sapphire caricature. This stereotype started with, you guessed it, slavery, and then it was perpetuated by the Jim Crow era. So this was a tactic that slave owners would use with the enslaved black women to make them undesirable and not pure looking in the eyes of society. Portrayed these black women as angry, aggressive, loud, and masculine, and they would drive away their partners and their children because they were so angry. So there'd be propaganda like this showing that black women are angry and aggressive to their male partners. We also saw this as recently as 2018 when Serena Williams had the notorious anger issue in the US Open Finals. And this is extremely problematic because it shows that black women can't have emotions. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 8. The Pickaninny caricature. The Pickaninny caricature was started in slavery but picked up its prevalence during Jim Crow era. Pickaninny referred to black children, or the child coon. They were depicted with bulging eyes, unkempt hair, big red lips, and wide smiles that they would fit watermelons in, which ties in the watermelon stereotype that I mentioned before. These depictions would often be shown in ads, postcards, billboards, and other ephemera, showing them being chased by an animal, especially crocodiles. And that perpetuated the joke that black children were only good for alligator food or food for wild animals. Children would also be shown in rags or no clothes at all, trying to connect the black parents, disconnect, and discard for their children. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 9. Black people don't know how to talk. Or African American Vernacular English. African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, or Ebonics, is just the dialect that African Americans stereotypically use. The origins of AAVE is slavery. Big surprise. AAVE, or Ebonics, uses a bunch of different dialects, uses a lot of rural Southern American English, and then also uses a lot of Gullah language. The common misconception about Ebonics is that it's lazy, sloppy, or uneducated. However, it is found that, like every other dialect and every other language, it has very logical grammar structures and verbal structures. So Ebonics, or AAVE, is a very valid intellectual language to speak. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 10. Soul food. So for the holidays, I decided to do something a little bit lighter so you guys aren't just sad for the rest of the day. The term soul food became popular in the 1960s when the civil rights era began to emerge. However, the food was originated during the time of slavery, when Africans were brought over and they were trying to form their own identity out of the scraps they were given when they were enslaved. The enslaved Africans weren't given a lot of good food, so they would take the scraps and the leftovers that they were given, such as chitlins or chicken gizzards or chicken livers, and try to turn it into something that was delicious for them. A lot of the cooking styles originated from Africa that they brought over and had strong influences within the Native American cuisine and the South cuisine. Happy holidays for whoever celebrates, and if you don't, just have a great day. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 11. Black-sounding names. So the origin of stereotypically black-sounding names comes from slavery, essentially. So when the Africans were brought over to the Americas, their names were changed either from ignorance, laziness, or just not caring from the slave traders. Oftentimes in ledgers or receipts, you would see the tribe names be westernized. So you'd get someone from the Andoni tribe, and that would be changed to Anthony, or from the Beke tribe, and that would be changed to Becky. In the 60s, with the civil rights era, you saw the rise of black people giving themselves their own names to kind of erase their slave name. A lot of them had influences from Islam. This topic is a bit expansive, so I'm going to make a follow-up video right now. Okay, So this is going to be that follow-up video I talked about in my previous video. So Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in, part 11B, essentially. So in the South, with the rise of the Creole language, especially in Louisiana, you would get names that had a lot of French influences. We use a lot of the la, or do sounding prefixes and add them to the name. So they would take stereotypically French sounding names like Andre, and you would add those prefixes together, and there you go, you get DeAndre. This style of naming can also be used with non-French sounding names like Lawanda, Lysandra, XYZ, and the list goes on. And we perceive those names as blacker than everything else because the white civilization villainized that and said it was uncultured and uncouth. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in, part 12. The turning black characters into animals trope. This isn't really a stereotype, it's more of a movie trope that we see in cinema over and over again. So now that Soul has been released on Disney, I think it's a very important time to talk about this trope in cinema. Animated studios, especially Disney, have a really bad habit of turning their black leads into animals or anthropomorphic beings of some sort. We have seen this throughout the years, and most notably in Princess and the Frog. This is the way that animated studios used to make their black protagonists seem more relatable to the white audience. In these movies, the black protagonist spends the majority of the movie as another form than their black original skin. This effectively shows that black people aren't meant to be related to and aren't meant to be seen as princesses or superheroes or anything else. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 13. Black people love Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid was invented in 1927 by Edward Perkins in Nebraska. It didn't become associated with the black community until around the 50s and 60s, when the marketing started being geared towards poor income communities. Segregation and the mass pulling out of white businesses in black communities, the black communities started becoming the poorer communities. Kool-Aid became kind of a rallying around point. It was cheap, it was good, and kids loved it. In 2011, Kraft, the company that owns Kool-Aid, started allocating their funds into exclusively branding towards Latinx communities and black communities. According to the brand, over 40% of the consumers are black Americans, and 20% of that are Latinx communities. Rooted in any overt racism, however, it became race-based when people would just assume black people would drink this because they could afford it. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 14. Absent black father stereotype. This stereotype is tricky because I couldn't find exact origins in slavery, but the likelihood of it being tied to slavery and mass incarceration is very high. In 1965, a white sociologist named Daniel Moynihan published a book called The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. In this, he claimed that the rising rates of children out of wedlock in single mother households in the African American communities signaled the destruction for black families. This report didn't take into consideration that a lot of black men had moved to different places to help provide for their family, and the rising rates of mass incarceration for black men. This is going to be another long topic, so I'm going to start another video right now. Okay, so this is going to be part B to my last video of the absentee father stereotype. In 2013, the CDC put out a report that stated that 72% of non-Hispanic black women that gave birth were unwed. Now that does not mean that their fathers aren't in their lives. Conversely, it shows that black men are statistically more likely to be in their children's lives more than Hispanic men or white men. Author John Loves found that 59.3% of black men live with their children. Even though we have these studies proving the stereotype as false, we see the media perpetuating these cycles in movies and TV shows and even in news reports. So statistically, white men or any other race of men are just as likely to not be in their children's lives as black men. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 16. The coon caricature, or lazy black person. So the term coon originates in slavery and derives from the animal raccoon. The word coon was and still is used to describe lazy black people, especially men. The coon was lazy, uneducated, idle, and very childlike, and used broken English. The slur coon was used a lot in slavery, but ramped up its popularity post-emancipation. The use of caricatures like this one started becoming very popular with media or advertising and even TV shows. This reinforcement of the stereotype that Black people, especially men, are lazy, unkempt, childlike, and idiotic was used to keep Black people down in society. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 17. Black people love grape soda. Surprisingly, this stereotype does not have groundings in slavery. I know, it's crazy. It actually started post-emancipation throughout the Civil Rights era. This actually jumps off the back of the Kool-Aid video that I have, so if you haven't watched it, I would. Essentially, sugary drinks like Kool-Aid and grape soda and a lot of other sodas were really cheap and marketed towards the African American community. It wasn't until 2003 when that stereotype began to become negative. The comedian Dave Chappelle had a popular stand-up series where he talked about Black foods and the stereotypes around them. In this, he joked that all Black people love grape drink. And since he has such a wide audience, this became kind of the gospel truth about Black people. And in the way Dave Chappelle jokes about this, it became negative. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 18. Black people have a higher pain tolerance. This stereotype isn't exclusive to the Black community, as it has been applied to many POCs throughout history. However, I'm just going to be focusing on the Black community today. The false belief that Black people have thicker skin and a higher pain tolerance has lasted from colonialism all the way today. In 1811, a medical paper was published stating that the enslaved Black people have a less exquisite body and mind and were able to endure so much more pain. In 1914, another medical paper stated that Black people have less sensitive nervous systems than white people and do not need as much anesthetics. Sadly, medical professionals still believe this. A study done in 2016 shows that over 40% of first-year and second-year medical students have these beliefs. This is why we see undertreated and undermedicated Black people today. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 19. Calling Black people apes. Equating people to apes goes back for centuries, at first just starting as an insult, but then became racially charged throughout the centuries. This became racially charged towards Black people when the Europeans started colonizing Africa in the 15th century. In 1570, a story by Antonio de Torquemadas became the leading example of how Africans became demonized and sexualized as apes. In the following centuries, simianization started entering into different sciences and humanities. Anthropology, archaeology, theology, and medicine were some of those fields. You also see this in the chattel slave trade, dehumanizing the Africans that were taken from their homes. This is still extremely prevalent. The most notable instance is when the Obamas entered the White House. We saw jokes and newspaper articles about the first simian couple to enter the White House. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 20. Black fetishization in porn. This directly ties into my part 4, the Jezebel caricature, and my part 6, the Mendigo caricature. So if you haven't seen those, I'd watch those. The mainstream porn industry fetishizes all people of color, but I'm only going to focus on the Black community here today. Ebony is the most searched for category in porn in the United States. Interestingly enough, that category is the most searched for in the southern states. In this category, instead of shying away from the harmful stereotypes that Black people have faced, they embrace it and monetize it. One of the largest tropes we see being perpetuated by the porn industry is Black men having large genitalia and being extremely sexually aggressive towards white women. Tropes like these directly carry over from the slave trade and are very dangerous to people today. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 21. Touching Black people's hair. I shouldn't have to say this. Don't touch Black people's hair. Touching Black people's hair plays into the dangerous perception that white hair is the norm and that Black hair is not, and it's interesting and it needs to be touched. It also has dangerous connotations to the exotic zoos that Black people were put in colonization. It is extremely insulting when you ask to touch a Black person's hair because you are simultaneously exoticizing them, animalizing them, and then acting like they're an other. And Black people have been dehumanized since colonialism, and so it dredges up all of these generational traumas. Hair isn't an extension of your body, it is your body. So when you touch someone's hair without their consent, you are violating that and you're violating their bodies. Our hair is hair. It is not wool, it is ours and it grows from our heads. Do not touch it. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 22. Blackface. The precise origins of blackface aren't really known. You can see its roots date back to centuries-old European theater productions such as Othello. Blackface wasn't really known in America until around the 18th century when European immigrants brought it over and performed these kind of shows in seaports. It wasn't until the 19th century when it really started gaining traction and popularity. For those who don't know, blackface is a theatrical art form where white actors paint their faces black to negatively portray black people. Thomas Rice is known as the father of American minstrel shows after he reportedly traveled to the South and observed the enslaved people in 1830 and created the character Jim Crow. This, once again, is a very large topic, so I'm going to do a part 2. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 22. Part 2. The character Jim Crow became so integral to how white people were viewing the former enslaved black people that after emancipation, when they were passing the black codes for how black people should act, they named Jim Crow as those laws. Surprisingly, most of the minstrel show actors were working-class Irishmen who started performing as blackface actors to kind of take the heat off of them and kind of authenticate their whiteness. The phenomena of blackface still occurs today. It has changed and kind of evolved, but it still happens. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 23. The Mammy caricature. The mammy was often portrayed as an obese, coarse, maternal woman who loved working for her white family but often looked towards her family in disdain. This caricature was created post-emancipation to control the narrative that enslaved black women really enjoyed working for their white slave owners. It was also used to distance the white slave masters from the narrative that they would prey upon their enslaved women. Because of this, they created an idea that their house servants were very unattractive and they would never go after them when they could have this beautiful white woman as their wife. Alternatively, the mammy character was seen as a kind, compassionate, and loving maternal figure for the white family. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 24. Black on black crime. The idea that black people have a predilection to crime, especially within their own communities, is deeply rooted in white supremacy. The specific notion of black on black crime first gained traction in 1876 when Frederick L. Hoffman released a book called The Racial Tendencies and Traits of the American Negro. Although black on black crime wasn't used as a term, he stated that the black people have a specific crime problem that needs to be addressed. However, that entire notion is wrong, because in 2019, the Bureau of Justice Statistics shows that those who commit violent acts tend to perpetuate those within their community. So it doesn't matter if you're black, it doesn't matter if you're white or Hispanic or etc., etc. Those in the same community tend to attack those in the same community. Black stereotypes and what they're grounded in. Part 25. Jungle fever. Jungle fever is a term used when white people sexually or romantically prefer black people for partners. That term gained traction in the 1820s when missionary work and explorer work would take them to Africa or jungle areas. In these journals, they wrote how exotic these black people are and how bizarre their attraction is to these people. In 1991, this term was thrust back into the zeitgeist with Spike Lee's movie Jungle Fever. And after that movie came out, you saw a very large uptick of this term being used. Jungle fever as a term is just very negative to use. It paints black people as oddities and exotic, and it fetishizes them. It also portrays the desire for interracial relationships as something just to be sweated out in a fleeting instance, where interracial relationships aren't that.